They appeared before the world as two handsome, grief-stricken young men, their faces etched with the sorrow of a great and terrible loss. They wept for the television cameras. They spoke of their love for their murdered parents, and they inherited a fortune. But behind the mask of their shared grief, Lyle and Eric Menendez were hiding a secret of almost unimaginable darkness. They were not the victims of a brutal crime. They were its architects, their tears a performance in a long, elaborate, and ultimately doomed play of their own creation. Tonight, we journey into the chilling world of the fractured self, exploring the chasm that can exist between the public face we present and the stranger that lurks within. These are stories about masks, about deceptions so profound they are maintained for years, only to crumble in a single catastrophic act of violence or betrayal. It is the unnerving silence of a suburban home with a terrible secret in its walls, the polite smile of a neighbor who is living a lie, the chilling realization that the person you thought you knew was a complete and utter stranger. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. It's always a humbling experience to see how far these stories travel, and how many of us are gathered here in this shared, quiet space. And on that note, if you truly appreciate what we do here, the quiet, respectful space we try to create for these stories, a like and a subscribe is the very best way to show it. It helps us continue this journey together. Now, dim the lights. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Menendez brothers' murders. In the summer of 1989, the neighborhood of Beverly Hills, California, was the glittering, sun-drenched symbol of American success. It was a world of palm-lined streets, of immaculate mansions hidden behind high hedges, and of a quiet, unassailable sense of wealth and privilege. And in a stately faux Tudor-style home at 722 North Elm Drive, the Menendez family seemed to be the very embodiment of that world. They were, by all outward appearances, a family that had achieved the American dream in its most extravagant form. The patriarch was Jose Menendez, a 45-year-old, self-made corporate titan, a Cuban immigrant who had fled the Castro regime as a teenager. He was a man of intense, almost ferocious, ambition. Through sheer force of will, he had climbed the corporate ladder, eventually becoming the CEO of Live Entertainment, a home video distribution company. He was demanding, charismatic, and obsessed with success, a man who drove his employees and his family with the same relentless, unforgiving standard he applied to himself. His wife, 47-year-old Mary Louise "Kitty" Menendez, was a former beauty queen, a woman who had given up her own career to raise their children and to manage the family's impressive social life. But beneath her polished, socialite exterior, Kitty was a woman adrift, plagued by anxiety, depression, and a growing sense of loneliness in a marriage that had become emotionally barren. She was a fragile, nervous woman, living in a gilded cage. They had two sons, the heirs to the Menendez fortune and the focus of Jose's obsessive, controlling ambition. The eldest was 21-year-old Lyle. He was enrolled at Princeton University, though his academic career was floundering. The younger was 18-year-old Eric, a recent high school graduate. Eric was shy, sensitive, and emotionally fragile, a boy who lived largely in the shadow of his domineering father and his more outgoing older brother. Both boys were gifted tennis players, and their father pushed them relentlessly, dreaming of them becoming professional champions. They had everything money could buy: expensive cars, designer clothes, a life of almost unimaginable privilege. To the outside world, the Menendez family, with their mansion, their tennis club memberships, and their Ivy League ambitions, were a portrait of perfect, aspirational success. But behind the closed doors of the Elm Drive estate, the reality was a dark and twisted caricature of the American dream. The house was not a home. It was a pressure cooker of psychological torment. Jose ruled the family with an iron fist. He was a tyrant, a man whose love was conditional, a prize to be earned through absolute obedience and success. His sons were not just his children. They were his projects, extensions of his own ego, and he subjected them to a relentless campaign of psychological, and the boys would later claim, horrific physical and sexual abuse. The atmosphere in the house was thick with fear, resentment, and a profound, unspoken misery. On the night of Sunday, August 20th, 1989. This long-simmering domestic tragedy was about to reach its brutal, explosive conclusion. Jose and Kitty were at home, relaxing in the den, watching a movie. Lyle and Eric had gone out, telling their parents they were going to the movies, but their real destination was a local sporting goods store where they had previously purchased two 12-gauge shotguns. They were armed and they were on their way home. The first hint of the horror that had unfolded came just after 11:45 p.m. A hysterical, almost theatrical 911 call was placed by Lyle Menendez. His voice was a torrent of panicked, sobbing words. "Somebody killed my parents," he screamed at the dispatcher. "My father, my mother, I don't know." The first Beverly Hills police officers to arrive on the scene found a bizarre and deeply unsettling tableau. The two brothers, Lyle and Eric, were on the front lawn of the mansion, wailing in a seemingly uncontrollable display of grief. Inside, in the first-floor den, the police found a scene of almost unimaginable carnage. Jose Menendez was slumped on the sofa, his body so ravaged by multiple shotgun blasts at close range that he was almost unrecognizable. A single, devastating shot to the back of his head had obliterated his face. Kitty Menendez lay on the floor nearby, her body also riddled with shotgun wounds, her face and chest destroyed. The room was a bloodbath, the walls and the expensive furniture peppered with buckshot. The sheer, explosive brutality of the crime was shocking, even to the hardened Beverly Hills detectives. This was not a clean, professional hit. The overkill, the number of shots fired, at least 6 to Jose and 10 to Kitty, spoke of a profound, personal, and almost ritualistic rage. This was an execution born of pure, unadulterated hatred. The police, at first, were baffled. Their immediate theory was that this was a mafia-style assassination. Jose Menendez, in his aggressive business dealings, had made his share of enemies. He had been involved in the often shady world of home video distribution, a business that was known to have connections to organized crime. The police began to investigate his business associates, his rivals, his enemies. It seemed to be the most logical explanation for such a brutal, professional-looking crime. But as the investigation continued, a new and far more disturbing theory began to take shape. A theory that was born not from the evidence at the crime scene, but from the strange, almost unnerving behavior of the two grieving sons. In the days and weeks following the murders, Lyle and Eric's public performance of grief began to crumble, replaced by a kind of manic, almost gleeful indulgence. They were now the heirs to a fortune estimated to be worth over $14 million, and they began to spend it with a reckless, almost taunting abandon. Their spending spree was staggering. Lyle bought a new Porsche Carrera, a new wardrobe of designer clothes, and a Rolex watch. Eric hired a personal tennis coach and began to travel the professional circuit. Together, they invested in a restaurant, they went on lavish trips, and they threw extravagant parties. Their grief, which had been so public and so dramatic on the night of the murders, seemed to have completely vanished, replaced by the giddy freedom of two young men who had just been released from a cage and handed a blank check. This bizarre, almost celebratory behavior did not go unnoticed. Their friends, their family, and, most importantly, the detectives who were working the case, began to watch them with a growing, cold suspicion. The mafia theory was beginning to look less and less plausible. The evidence was pointing in a different, far more disturbing direction. The police were beginning to suspect that the killers were not some shadowy figures from the criminal underworld, but were the two handsome, well-spoken, and now very wealthy, young men who had been the first to report the crime. The investigation was turning inward, and the focus was now squarely on the two grieving sons. While Lyle and Eric Menendez were embarking on their extravagant post-mortem spending spree, the Beverly Hills Police Department was quietly and methodically building a case against them. The initial theory of a mob hit had all but dissolved under the weight of the brothers' own bizarre behavior. The detectives were now operating on a new and far more chilling hypothesis: that the murders of Jose and Kitty Menendez were not an act of outside aggression, but a cold, calculated, and brutal act of parricide, committed by their own sons for the purpose of inheriting their immense fortune. The investigation was a slow, painstaking process. There was no direct physical evidence, No fingerprints, no murder weapons to tie the brothers to the crime scene. The case was almost entirely circumstantial, a puzzle that had to be assembled from a series of small, damning pieces. The police began by dissecting the brothers' alibis. Lyle and Eric had claimed they had been at the movies on the night of the murders, seeing the James Bond film License to Kill. They then said they had planned to meet a friend at a food festival in Santa Monica called the Taste of LA, but had gotten lost and had eventually gone to a different event, the Feast of the August Moon at a local restaurant. It was on their way home from this event, they claimed, that they had discovered the horrific scene at their mansion. The alibi was flimsy and full of holes. Investigators could find no one who had seen them at the movie theater. There was no ticket stub, and their story of getting lost on the way to a major, well-publicized event in their own city seemed improbable. The police believed that the alibi was a hastily constructed fiction, a story designed to account for their time while they were actually at home, committing the murders. The detectives also delved into the brothers' activities in the months leading up to the crime. They discovered that just 2 days before the murders, Eric and Lyle had purchased two 12-gauge shotguns from a sporting goods store in San Diego. They had used a fake ID to buy the ammunition. The purchase of these specific weapons, the same type of weapon that had been used to obliterate their parents, was a powerful, if not definitive, piece of circumstantial evidence. But the real breakthrough in the case, the piece that would transform the police's suspicion into a near certainty, came not from a detective's hunch, but from a psychologist's office. In the months following the murders, Eric Menendez, who was deeply troubled and racked with a mixture of guilt and fear, had begun to see a therapist, a man named Dr. L. Jerome Oziel. In his sessions with Dr. Oziel, Eric, believing he was in a safe, confidential space, unburdened himself. He confessed to everything. He gave the doctor a detailed, step-by-step account of the murders, describing how he and Lyle had planned the crime, how they had waited for their parents to be relaxed and vulnerable in the den, and how they had burst in and shot them to death. It was a full, detailed, and horrifying confession. The confession, however, was protected by the sacred, legal principle of doctor-patient confidentiality. Dr. Oziel was legally and ethically bound to keep his patients' secrets, but the situation became far more complicated. Lyle Menendez, who had a far more controlling and manipulative personality, became aware that his younger brother was confessing. Terrified that the secret would get out, Lyle confronted Dr. Oziel. He began to make a series of veiled and then open threats against the therapist and his family, trying to intimidate him into silence. This act of intimidation was a critical and ultimately fatal mistake. By threatening the therapist, Lyle had, in the eyes of the law, created a situation where Dr. Oziel was no longer just a passive keeper of a patient's confidence, but a potential victim of a new crime. This would later become the legal argument for breaking the seal of confidentiality. The secret was further compromised by Dr. Oziel's own mistress, a woman named Judalon Smith. Smith had been present during some of the tense, dramatic confrontations between the brothers and the therapist. She had even been tasked by Dr. Oziel with taking notes and listening in on some of the sessions. She was now a witness, a third party who had heard the confession and the threats. Fearing for her own safety, and after her own tumultuous relationship with Dr. Oziel had soured, Judalon Smith went to the Beverly Hills police. She told them everything she had heard. She told them that the Menendez brothers had confessed to their therapist that they had killed their own parents. Her story was the smoking gun the police had been looking for. It was the corroboration they needed to turn their circumstantial case into a prosecutable one. Armed with her testimony, the police were able to get a search warrant for Dr. Oziel's office, and they seized the audio tapes of his therapy sessions with the brothers. The legal battle over the admissibility of these tapes would be long and fierce, but the police now knew what was on them. They had their confession. In March of 1990, 7 months after the murders, the Beverly Hills Police Department finally made its move. Lyle Menendez was arrested in a dramatic takedown on the street. A few days later, Eric, who had been out of the country for a tennis tournament, surrendered to the police upon his return. The two handsome, grieving sons, the heirs to the Menendez fortune, were now charged with the first-degree murder of their parents. The arrests were a national sensation. The story of the two wealthy Beverly Hills brothers who had allegedly killed their parents for their inheritance was a tale of greed, betrayal, and patricide that was almost biblical in its scope. The case was set for trial, a trial that would become one of the most famous and most controversial in American history. It was a trial that would tear the veil off the seemingly perfect world of a privileged family and expose a dark, hidden world of secrets, abuse, and a rage so profound that it had ended in a bloody, shotgun massacre in the quiet of a Sunday night. The trial of Lyle and Eric Menendez, which began in July of 1993, was not just a legal proceeding. It was a groundbreaking cultural event. It was one of the first major trials to be broadcast live, gavel to gavel, on the new cable channel, Court TV. The entire nation was given a front-row seat to a family drama that was more shocking, more complex, and more compelling than any television soap opera. The trial would not just determine the fate of the two brothers. It would ignite a fierce and deeply divisive national conversation about wealth, privilege, and the dark, often hidden, reality of child abuse. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Pamela Bozanek, presented a case that was straightforward and, in their view, unassailable. Their narrative was a simple and powerful one, a classic story of greed. They portrayed Lyle and Eric Menendez as two spoiled, sociopathic rich kids who had grown impatient waiting for their inheritance. They argued that the brothers had grown accustomed to a lavish lifestyle, a lifestyle that was threatened by their father's increasingly strict and controlling nature, and by their own personal and academic failures. They had, the prosecution argued, executed their parents in a cold, calculated, and brutal act of patricide and matricide, motivated by a single, simple desire: money. To support this narrative, the prosecution presented the evidence of the brothers' extravagant spending spree in the months following the murders. They showed the jury the receipts for the Rolex watches, the Porsche, the expensive restaurants, the personal tennis coach, and the myriad of other luxury purchases. This, they argued, was not the behavior of two grieving sons. It was the gleeful, celebratory behavior of two young men who had just inherited a $14 million fortune and were finally free from their father's oppressive rule. The prosecution also focused on the meticulous execution-style nature of the killings. They presented the gruesome crime scene photos and the autopsy reports, detailing the sheer, explosive violence of the shotgun blasts. They argued that the overkill, the multiple shots fired at close range, the reloading of the weapons, and the final, obliterating shot to Jose's head were all evidence of a deep-seated hatred and a cold, ruthless, and premeditated intent to kill. This was not a crime of passion, they contended. It was an assassination, and the controversial therapy tapes, while not a full confession in court, provided a chilling, behind-the-scenes glimpse into the brothers' state of mind, a chronicle of their guilt and their fear of being caught. But the defense, led by a brilliant and famously tenacious defense attorney named Leslie Abramson, representing Eric, and Jill Lansing, representing Lyle, had a counter-narrative that was just as powerful and far more shocking. Abramson, in particular, was a master of courtroom drama, a fierce and passionate advocate who was about to put the victims themselves on trial. The defense did not deny that Lyle and Eric had killed their parents. Instead, they argued that they had done so not out of greed, but out of a lifetime of unbearable, terrifying, and secret abuse that had left them in a state of mortal fear for their own lives. In a stunning and dramatic opening, the defense unveiled a secret history of the Menendez family, a history that was a dark, twisted inversion of the perfect American dream. The centerpiece of their case was the testimony of the brothers themselves. For days, Lyle and Eric sat on the witness stand, and in quiet, often tearful and emotionally wrenching testimony, they painted a portrait of a home that was not a mansion, but a torture chamber. They described their father, Jose, not as a successful, ambitious businessman, but as a monstrous, tyrannical pedophile. They testified that, for as long as they could remember, Jose had subjected them to a relentless campaign of horrific sexual, physical, and psychological abuse. Eric, the more fragile of the two, gave a particularly harrowing and graphic account, describing years of nightly assaults, of a childhood stolen, of a soul that had been systematically and completely destroyed. Lyle, in his testimony, described his own abuse and the deep, corrosive sense of shame and powerlessness that had consumed him. They also portrayed their mother, Kitty, not as a glamorous socialite, but as a deeply disturbed, alcoholic, and emotionally volatile woman who was a co-conspirator in their abuse. They claimed that she was aware of what Jose was doing to them, and that she had not only failed to protect them, but had often been a cruel and taunting participant in their psychological torment. The defense argued that on the night of the murders, the brothers had finally reached a breaking point. They claimed that Jose had threatened to kill them if they ever exposed his secrets. They testified that they were in a state of imperfect self-defense, that they genuinely, if perhaps unreasonably, believed that they had to kill their parents before their parents killed them. They were not, the defense argued, cold-blooded killers seeking a fortune. They were two terrified, traumatized boys who had finally, violently, fought back against their tormentors. The trial became a sensational, two-sided drama. The prosecution would present the evidence of the spending spree, and the defense would counter with another horrifying story of abuse. The prosecution would show the crime scene photos, and the defense would counter with the tearful testimony of a cousin who claimed she too had been abused by Jose. The case divided the public. To some, the brothers were greedy, manipulative sociopaths, cynically using a fabricated story of abuse to escape responsibility for a brutal, cold-blooded murder. To others, they were tragic, sympathetic victims, two boys who had been pushed to the brink by an unimaginable, hidden horror. The trial was also unique in its structure. Because the brothers had separate legal teams and had given separate confessions that implicated each other to different degrees, the judge ruled that they would be tried together, but with two separate juries. One jury would decide Lyle's fate, and the other would decide Eric's, both sitting in the same courtroom, hearing the same evidence. This unusual setup added another layer of complexity and drama to the already sensational proceedings. After 6 months of testimony that had been broadcast into the living rooms of America, the two juries began their deliberations. The entire country was on the edge of its seat, waiting to see which narrative would prevail: the prosecution's story of greed or the defense's story of abuse. The verdicts, everyone assumed, would be a definitive statement on the nature of the crime and the character of the two brothers who had committed it. The verdicts from the two separate juries, when they were finally delivered in January of 1994, did nothing to resolve the deep and bitter divisions that the case had exposed. Instead, they plunged the legal proceedings into a state of even greater chaos and uncertainty. Both juries, after weeks of intense and often emotional deliberation, announced that they were deadlocked. They were unable to reach a unanimous decision. The split was a mirror of the public's own divided opinion. In both juries, a majority of the jurors had voted for a conviction on the lesser charge of manslaughter, swayed by the powerful and sympathetic testimony of the abuse. But a determined minority in each jury had held out for a first-degree murder conviction, believing that the evidence of premeditation and the motive of greed were too strong to ignore. The result was a hung jury for both Lyle and Eric Menendez. The judge was forced to declare a mistrial. The outcome was a stunning victory for the defense and a humiliating defeat for the prosecution. Leslie Abramson and her team had successfully planted enough doubt in the minds of the jurors to save their clients from a murder conviction. But the victory was a temporary one. The brothers were not acquitted. They were still in legal limbo, and the district attorney's office, feeling the sting of the public defeat, immediately announced its intention to retry them. The second trial of Lyle and Eric Menendez, which began in late 1995, was a far different affair from the first. The legal landscape had changed. In the wake of the highly publicized and deeply divisive O.J. Simpson trial, which had just concluded with a stunning acquittal, the public's appetite for televised courtroom dramas had soured. In a crucial, and for the defense, a devastating decision, the judge in the second Menendez trial, Judge Stanley Weisberg, who had also presided over the first trial, ruled that the proceedings would not be televised. The cameras were gone. The absence of the cameras fundamentally altered the dynamics of the courtroom. The trial was no longer a public spectacle. It was a quiet, focused legal proceeding. Judge Weisberg also made another, even more critical ruling. This time, there would be only one jury. The two brothers would be tried together, and their fate would be decided by a single group of 12 people. The prosecution, now led by a new, more aggressive lead prosecutor named David Kahn, came to the second trial with a new, more focused strategy. They had learned from their mistakes. They were determined not to let the defense control the narrative this time. They successfully argued to have the judge severely limit the scope of the abuse testimony, arguing that even if the abuse had occurred, it did not legally justify the cold, calculated execution of their parents. The prosecution relentlessly attacked the credibility of the abuse claims. They presented evidence that the brothers had only remembered the most graphic details of the sexual abuse after months of intensive therapy and preparation with their defense team. They argued that the abuse narrative was a cynical, fabricated defense, a story that had been expertly crafted by Leslie Abramson to manipulate the jury's emotions. They kept their own case focused, simple, and brutal. This was about greed. They hammered away at the spending spree, at the purchase of the shotguns, at the inconsistencies in the brothers' alibis, without the sympathetic eye of the television cameras. And with their abuse testimony heavily restricted, the brothers' performance on the stand in the second trial was far less effective. They came across not as tragic, traumatized victims, but as cold, remorseless, and arrogant young men. In April of 1996, after a much shorter and less sensational trial, the single jury returned its verdict. This time, there was no deadlock. They found both Lyle and Eric Menendez guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. They also found true the special circumstances of lying in wait and multiple murders, a finding that made the brothers eligible for the death penalty. The jury in the penalty phase ultimately decided against the death penalty, and the 2 brothers were sentenced to 2 consecutive terms of life in prison, without the possibility of parole. They were sent to separate prisons and would not see each other again for over 20 years. The legacy of the Menendez brothers case is a complex and enduring one. It was a story that peeled back the placid, sun-drenched facade of Beverly Hills to reveal a dark, dysfunctional world of secrets, lies, and unimaginable family trauma. It was a landmark case in the history of televised trials, a spectacle that raised profound questions about the media-saturated legal system and its ability to deliver justice. And most importantly, it was a case that forced a national conversation about the long-term, devastating effects of child abuse. The trial was one of the first to use the abuse excuse as a major defense in a high-profile murder case, and it left the public deeply divided. Was the abuse real, a mitigating factor that explained, if not excused, the brothers' actions? Or was it a cynical, fabricated defense, a get-out-of-jail-free card that insulted the memory of their parents and made a mockery of real victims of abuse? The question remains a subject of intense debate to this day. In the years since their conviction, the case has seen a resurgence of interest, particularly among a new generation that has re-examined the trial through the lens of a greater modern understanding of trauma and PTSD. In 2018, Lyle and Eric Menendez were reunited, both having been transferred to the same correctional facility in Southern California. They remain in prison, now middle-aged men, destined to spend the rest of their lives behind bars. The story of the Menendez brothers is a modern-day Greek tragedy, a story of a family dynasty that was destroyed from within. It is a story with no easy answers, no clear heroes or villains. It is a story that leaves us with a set of profound and unsettling questions about the nature of victimhood, the cycle of violence, and the dark, often unknowable, secrets that can lie at the heart of even the most seemingly perfect American family. The betrayal of Robert Hansen. In the rigid, gray, and deeply insular world of the Federal Bureau of Investigation during the Cold War, Robert Philip Hansen was a man who seemed to have been cast from the central mold. He was quiet, intellectually arrogant, and possessed a kind of dour, unimposing presence that made him almost invisible. He was a man of devout, almost fanatical Catholic faith, a member of the conservative Opus Dei prelature. He was a dedicated family man with 6 children, living a life of quiet, middle-class respectability in the sprawling, leafy suburbs of Northern Virginia. To his colleagues in the Bureau, he was a known quantity, a brilliant but socially awkward computer expert, a man who was more comfortable with data and systems than with people, a reliable, if somewhat strange, cog in the vast machine of American counterintelligence. He was, by all outward appearances, the very last person you would ever suspect of being a traitor. But behind the mask of the pious, unassuming bureaucrat, Robert Hansen was living a secret life of breathtaking deception and profound psychological complexity. He was a man of deep, irreconcilable contradictions. He was a devout Catholic who frequented strip clubs and posted explicit stories about his own wife on internet forums. He was a fierce anti-communist who was also, for more than 2 decades, the most damaging and destructive mole in the history of the FBI, a master spy for the Soviet Union and later the Russian Federation. His journey into treason did not begin with a grand ideological conversion or a moment of high-stakes blackmail. It began, as so many betrayals do, with a quiet, personal crisis of ego and finance. In 1979, Hansen was a young agent, working in a counterintelligence unit in the FBI's New York field office. He was ambitious but felt undervalued and underpaid. He was a man who believed his own intellect to be far superior to that of his colleagues. Yet he was struggling to pay the bills for his growing family, in a move that was both brazen and remarkably clumsy for a trained counterintelligence officer. He decided to make contact with the enemy. He wrote a letter to the GRU, the Soviet Military Intelligence Agency, and anonymously offered his services. He included in the letter a piece of classified information to prove his bona fides, the name of a high-ranking GRU general, Dmitry Polyakov, who was secretly working as a double agent for the United States. Polyakov was one of the most valuable assets the U.S. had ever recruited, a man who had been providing invaluable intelligence for years. Hansen, in his very first act of treason, handed him a death sentence. He met with the Soviets, received a payment of $20,000, and then, in a fit of panic and guilt, he broke off all contact. He had crossed the line, but he had managed, he believed, to step back. For the next 6 years, Robert Hansen was a dormant spy. He continued his career at the FBI, his secret locked away, a dark chapter he had seemingly closed. He transferred back to Washington, D.C., where he was given a series of increasingly sensitive assignments, positions that gave him almost unfettered access to the FBI's most vital counterintelligence secrets. Then, in 1985, he decided to reactivate himself. The reasons were a familiar cocktail of ego and greed. He still felt his genius was unappreciated by the Bureau's bureaucracy, and he was still struggling with debt. On October 1st, 1985, he wrote another anonymous letter, this time to the KGB, the main Soviet intelligence agency. He offered them his services again, and to prove his value, he gave them the names of 3 more KGB officers who were secretly working for the FBI and were stationed at the Soviet embassy in Washington. This was a catastrophic, devastating blow to American intelligence. Unbeknownst to Hansen, at the exact same time, on the other side of town in the halls of the CIA, another disgruntled, debt-ridden officer named Aldrich Ames was also in the process of selling the same and other secrets to the KGB. In the space of just a few months, the 2 most destructive moles in American history, working completely independently of one another, had systematically dismantled the entire U.S. intelligence network inside the Soviet Union. The effect was immediate and brutal. The FBI and the CIA's most valuable human assets began to disappear. Communications went silent. One after another, the agents who had been providing a crucial window into the inner workings of the Kremlin were being arrested, interrogated, and executed. The American intelligence community was plunged into a state of profound crisis. They knew with a sickening certainty that they had a mole, or more terrifyingly, that they might have more than one. A massive, top-secret mole hunt was launched, a desperate, paranoid search for the traitor or traitors who were operating from the very heart of their own organizations. And this is where the story of Robert Hansen takes on a dimension of almost surreal, diabolical irony. As a senior analyst in the FBI's Soviet counterintelligence unit, Hansen was not just a subject of the mole hunt. He was put in charge of it. He was assigned to lead the very investigation that was supposed to be looking for him. It was a position of almost unimaginable power and deception. From his desk at FBI headquarters, he had a god's-eye view of the entire investigation. He could monitor their progress, he could see what leads they were following, and most importantly, he could subtly misdirect their efforts, steering them away from himself and toward dead ends. He was the fox who had been put in charge of guarding the henhouse, a henhouse that he himself had just raided. For years, he played this deadly double game with a cool, intellectual precision. He would attend high-level meetings where his colleagues would agonize over the devastating losses, and he would offer his own expert analysis, all the while knowing that he was the cause of their pain. He watched as the investigation began to focus on the CIA, where the more flamboyant and careless spending of Aldrich Ames was beginning to raise red flags. He even, in a move of pure, audacious genius, recommended that the FBI investigate Ames, knowing that the discovery of a mole at the CIA would be the perfect way to provide an explanation for the losses and to call off the hunt for a second, far more dangerous, mole at the FBI. While Ames was being investigated, Hansen continued to feed a steady stream of the nation's most sensitive secrets to his KGB handlers. He used a complex and highly disciplined system of dead drops to pass information and receive payments, a system he himself had helped design as a counterintelligence officer. He would hide packages of classified documents under bridges in remote Virginia parks, his signal to his handlers a single piece of tape on a park sign. He compromised every conceivable aspect of American intelligence. He gave the Soviets the details of the FBI's most secret technical surveillance programs. He revealed the existence of a massive, multi-billion-dollar spy satellite system. And in one of his most damaging acts, he told them about a secret tunnel that the FBI had dug under the new Soviet embassy in Washington, a highly classified and incredibly expensive operation designed to eavesdrop on their communications. His betrayal rendered the entire years-long project completely useless before it had even begun. He was not just selling secrets. He was gutting the very foundations of the American intelligence apparatus, all while pretending to be one of its most loyal protectors. He was the ultimate insider, a ghost in his own machine, and for over a decade he was completely and terrifyingly invisible. The capture of the CIA mole, Aldrich Ames, in 1994 was a moment of profound relief for the American intelligence community. They had found a traitor, a man whose greed had led to the deaths of at least 10 of their most valuable assets. The case was a massive public scandal, but it also provided a neat, if horrifying, explanation for the catastrophic intelligence losses of the mid-1980s. The book, it seemed, was closed. The hunt for the mole was over. But for a small, dedicated group of counterintelligence analysts at both the CIA and the FBI, the Ames case, as satisfying as it was, did not explain everything. There were still anomalies, still whispers of compromised operations and lost secrets that did not fit the timeline or the access profile of Aldrich Ames. There was a nagging, persistent feeling that something was still wrong, that another, deeper betrayal was still undiscovered. Robert Hansen, who had so brilliantly used the Ames investigation as a smokescreen, continued his espionage with a renewed sense of confidence. With the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, his loyalty had seamlessly transferred to its successor, the new Russian intelligence service, the SVR. He continued to meet his handlers, to use his dead drops, and to sell the secrets of his country. The flow of money continued, a steady, secret stream of cash and diamonds that supplemented his government salary. He was, by the late 1990s, the most successful and longest-running mole in American history, a ghost who had haunted the FBI for the better part of 2 decades. The first serious cracks in his invisible facade began to appear in the late 1990s. The FBI, still troubled by the unexplained anomalies, decided to open a new, highly secretive, and deeply sensitive internal investigation. They began to re-examine every single compromised case, looking for a new pattern, a new common denominator. They slowly and painstakingly began to build a profile of a second, unknown mole. They knew he had to be an insider, someone with long-term, high-level access to the most sensitive counterintelligence files. And they knew, from the timing of certain specific compromises, that he had to be someone who was still active within the Bureau. The investigation was a delicate and paranoid affair. The mole hunters had to operate with the terrifying knowledge that their own investigation could be compromised at any moment by the very person they were hunting. They worked in a secure, isolated space, their every move shrouded in secrecy. They gave their unknown subject a code name, Gray Suit. They began to draw up a new list of suspects, a small, elite group of senior FBI officials who had the right combination of access, opportunity, and longevity. And on that list, once again, was the name of Robert Hansen. But this time, he was not just one name among many. His profile, his assignments, his specific access to certain compromised files, it all began to align with the profile of gray suit with a chilling, almost perfect precision. But they still had no direct smoking gun evidence. Hansen was a master of tradecraft. He was disciplined, he was careful, and he had spent his entire career studying the very methods that were now being used to hunt him. He was a counterintelligence officer's worst nightmare. A spy who knew all the tricks. The breakthrough, when it came, was not the result of a brilliant deduction or a slip-up by Hansen. It was a stroke of incredible luck. A gift from the very people he was betraying his country to. In the late 1990s, the U.S. government was able to acquire a secret internal KGB file. The source of this file and the exact methods used to obtain it remain one of the most closely guarded secrets in the history of American intelligence. Some have speculated that it was purchased from a disgruntled former KGB agent for a massive sum of money, perhaps as much as $7 million. Whatever its origin, the file was a treasure trove, a Rosetta Stone for the mole hunt. It was the KGB's own internal administrative file on their most valuable American mole, a spy they had codenamed Ramon Garcia. The file contained a wealth of information, the dates and locations of his dead drops, the details of his payments, and, most importantly, a verbatim transcript of a conversation he had had with his handlers. The file did not contain the mole's real name, but it contained enough specific, personal, and professional details that there could be no doubt about his identity. As the FBI mole hunters read through the file, they felt a growing, sickening sense of recognition. Ramon Garcia mentioned a specific, obscure quote from General George S. Patton, a quote that Robert Hansen was famously and annoyingly fond of using. He made references to his devout Catholic faith. He described details of specific FBI operations that only a tiny handful of people, including Hansen, would have known. The profile was a perfect one-to-one match. Robert Hansen and Ramon Garcia were the same person. They had found their mole. With this definitive, irrefutable proof in hand, the final stage of the investigation began. The goal was no longer to identify the mole, but to catch him in the act, to build an airtight criminal case against him, and, most importantly, to do so without tipping him off. In late 2000, the FBI pulled Hansen out of his sensitive counterintelligence position. They created a fake, new job for him, a promotion to a senior position overseeing the FBI's computer security. It was a ruse, a job in a specially created office that was, in reality, a high-tech surveillance trap. The office was wired with hidden cameras and microphones. His new computer was a clone, its every keystroke monitored. He was given a new, young, and seemingly adoring assistant, a junior agent who was, in reality, a skilled undercover operative tasked with watching his every move. Robert Hansen, a man whose ego had long been bruised by a perceived lack of respect from the Bureau, took the bait completely. He saw the new job as a long overdue recognition of his genius. He had no idea that he had just walked into a cage, and that his every word, his every move, his every tap on a keyboard was being watched, recorded, and analyzed by the very organization he had spent a lifetime betraying. The final, elaborate sting operation was in place. The ghost who had haunted the FBI for 22 years was about to be made flesh. The final months of Robert Hansen's career at the FBI were a masterclass in controlled surveillance, a slow, patient, and deeply surreal game of cat and mouse, where the mouse had no idea he was being watched. From his new, specially created office, the FBI observed him, waiting for him to make a final, damning move. They watched as he used his new, monitored computer to access classified databases. They listened to his conversations, and they shadowed him with a team of over 300 agents, a massive covert operation dedicated to tracking the movements of a single, unassuming man. The tension within the FBI was immense. They knew they were sitting on the biggest espionage case in their history, and the fear that Hansen might somehow detect the surveillance and bolt was a constant, gnawing presence. But Hansen, in his arrogance, seemed oblivious. He was comfortable in his new role, enjoying the status and the seeming respect it afforded him. He had no idea that his world was about to come crashing down. The final act was set for Sunday, February 18, 2001. The FBI, through their surveillance, knew that Hansen was preparing to make another dead drop. to deliver a package of classified information to his Russian handlers. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the chance to catch him red-handed in the very act of committing espionage. The day was cold and gray. Hansen spent the morning at church with his family, a final performance of his role as the devout Catholic patriarch. After church, he went home, and then, in the late afternoon, he told his wife he was going for a drive. He got into his car and began the familiar, secret journey to his drop site. It was a place he had used many times before, a small, wooded park in the town of Vienna, Virginia, called Foxstone Park. The park was swarming with FBI agents, all hidden, all waiting. They were dressed as joggers, as parents with strollers, as maintenance workers. The entire area was under a complete but invisible lockdown. They watched as Hansen's car pulled into the park. He got out and, carrying a black plastic trash bag, took a short walk along a familiar path. He approached a wooden footbridge that crossed a small creek. He stopped, looked around, and then, in a swift, practiced motion, he placed the bag of secrets underneath the bridge. He then walked back to his car. As he was about to get in, the trap was sprung. A team of FBI agents swarmed his vehicle, their cars blocking his escape. FBI, freeze! They shouted. Hansen, a man who had lived a life of secrets and shadows for 22 years, was caught completely by surprise. He offered no resistance. His first, and deeply revealing, words to the arresting agents were not a denial, but a petulant, almost childish complaint. "What took you so long?" he reportedly asked. In the trash bag under the bridge, the FBI found exactly what they were expecting: a package containing highly classified government documents, wrapped and ready for his Russian handlers. In his car, they found thousands of dollars in cash from a previous payment. The evidence was absolute and irrefutable. Robert Hansen, the master spy, the ghost in the machine, was finally in custody. The news of his arrest was a bombshell, a profound and deeply embarrassing shock to the FBI and the entire U.S. intelligence community. The Aldrich Ames case at the CIA had been a scandal, but this was, in many ways, worse. This was not a bumbling, alcoholic officer whose greed was an open secret. This was one of their own, a senior counterintelligence official, a man who had been entrusted with the nation's most sensitive secrets and who had been tasked with hunting the very spies that he was. The sense of betrayal within the Bureau was absolute. The damage assessment that followed was a grim and horrifying accounting of his 2 decades of treason. He had compromised, in his own words, everything. He had given the Russians the names of more than 50 human assets, at least 3 of whom were confirmed to have been executed. He had revealed the entire scope of the FBI's technical surveillance programs, including the secret tunnel under the Soviet embassy. He had given them the U.S. government's plans for continuity of government in the event of a nuclear attack, a secret so vital that its compromise could have fundamentally altered the balance of the Cold War. He had handed over thousands of pages of classified documents, detailing everything from American nuclear strategy to the identities of FBI double agents. The full strategic impact of his betrayal is likely immeasurable, a wound on the national security of the United States that will never be fully understood. And he had done it all for a total of just over $1.4 million in cash and diamonds, a surprisingly small sum for the scale of his treachery. Faced with the overwhelming evidence against him, and the very real prospect of the death penalty for espionage, Robert Hansen, like Aldrich Ames before him, chose to cooperate. He agreed to a plea bargain. He would tell the government everything he had done, providing a full, detailed debriefing of his entire career as a spy. In exchange, the government would not seek the death penalty. In the debriefings that followed, a strange and complex psychological portrait of the man began to emerge. His motivations, it became clear, were a toxic and deeply personal mixture of ego, resentment, and a strange, compartmentalized morality. He was a man who believed he was intellectually superior to his colleagues, and who felt deeply resentful that his genius had never been fully recognized or rewarded by the FBI's bureaucracy. Spying, for him, was a way to prove that he was smarter than everyone else, a secret intellectual game that he was winning. He was also driven by a strange, almost pathological, need for the thrill of the secret life, a need that also manifested itself in his bizarre and sordid sexual life. He was a man who could compartmentalize his actions to an almost unimaginable degree, a man who could go to confession on a Sunday morning and then sell his country's secrets in a park that afternoon, all without seeming to feel a flicker of genuine remorse or contradiction. He was not a man who had been broken by the system. He was a man who had held the system in contempt, and who had used its own rules and its own trust to systematically destroy it from within. In July of 2001, Robert Hansen pleaded guilty to 15 counts of espionage and conspiracy. As part of his plea agreement, he was sentenced to 15 consecutive life sentences, with no possibility of parole. He was sent to the ADX Florence Supermax prison in Colorado, the most secure federal prison in the United States, a facility designed to hold the most dangerous and high-risk inmates in the federal system. It is a place of almost total isolation, a modern-day Alcatraz where inmates spend 23 hours a day in solitary confinement in a small concrete cell. It was a fitting, if deeply ironic, end for a man who had lived his life in a self-imposed prison of secrets and lies. He would spend the rest of his life in a real one. The legacy of the Robert Hansen case was a profound and deeply humbling moment of reckoning for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The scandal was, without question, the worst intelligence disaster in the Bureau's long and storied history. It was a failure on every conceivable level, a failure of security, failure of counterintelligence, and, most painfully, a failure of culture. The fact that a man like Hansen could operate as a mole for 22 years, from the very heart of the FBI's counterintelligence division, exposed a shocking and dangerous level of institutional blindness and complacency. The investigation that followed his arrest revealed a culture that was deeply resistant to looking inward, a culture where the trust between fellow agents was so absolute that it created a powerful shield for a traitor to hide behind. The Hansen case, even more than the Ames case at the CIA, shattered the illusion that the biggest threats were from the outside. It proved that the most dangerous enemy could be the quiet, unassuming man in the next cubicle. In the aftermath of the scandal, the FBI was forced to implement the most sweeping and radical overhaul of its internal security procedures in its history. The changes were modeled on the kind of rigorous, trust but verify systems that the CIA had been forced to adopt after the Ames case. The Bureau created a new, powerful, and independent counterintelligence division, tasked with constantly and aggressively hunting for internal threats. They implemented mandatory, periodic polygraph examinations for all agents with access to sensitive information. Financial disclosure requirements were made far more stringent, making it much harder for an employee to hide a sudden, unexplained influx of wealth. The entire security clearance process was revamped. The old, clubby culture of absolute, unquestioning trust was replaced by a new, more skeptical, and more professional system of checks and balances. The Hansen case also had a profound impact on the relationship between the FBI and the CIA. The two agencies, which had a long and often contentious history of rivalry, had been forced to work together on the joint mole hunt that had finally caught Hansen. The success of that collaboration, born from a shared sense of crisis, helped to foster a new era of closer cooperation and information sharing between the two pillars of the American intelligence community, a change that would become even more critical in the post-9/11 world. For Robert Hansen himself, his long years in the Supermax prison were a quiet, lonely, and unremarkable end to an extraordinary life of deception. He reportedly remained a devout Catholic, attending Mass and receiving communion in his prison cell. He was largely unrepentant, continuing to see his actions through the warped lens of his own intellectual and moral superiority. He died in his cell in June of 2023, at the age of 79, a quiet, anonymous end for the man who had been the most damaging spy in American history. The story of Robert Hansen endures as a chilling and deeply complex cautionary tale. It is a story about the profound and often unfathomable contradictions of the human soul. It is a study in the psychology of betrayal, a reminder that the motivations for treason are not always grand and ideological, but can be born from the quiet, petty, and deeply personal resentments of a wounded ego. Hansen was a man who possessed a brilliant mind, a deep faith, and a profound capacity for self-delusion, a man who was able to hold two completely contradictory sets of values in his head at the same time, without ever seeming to be crushed by the weight of the contradiction. He was the ultimate insider, a man who used his intimate knowledge of the system to exploit its every weakness. His story is a permanent, sobering reminder to every intelligence agency in the world that no system is foolproof, that no security measure is absolute, and that the greatest vulnerability of any organization is, and will always be, the human heart, with its complex and often unknowable mixture of loyalty and resentment, of faith and corruption, of good and evil. He was the ghost in the machine, and his long, silent reign of terror stands as a permanent warning that the most important secrets are only as safe as the flawed, fallible, and ultimately mysterious human beings who are entrusted to keep them. The disappearance of Agatha Christie. The England of 1926 was a country caught between two worlds, a nation still haunted by the long, ghostly shadow of the Great War, yet fizzing with the new, frenetic energy of the Jazz Age. In the quiet, rolling hills of Berkshire, in a comfortable home named Styles, a young author was living at the very center of this new, modern world. At 36 years old, Agatha Christie was no longer just a promising writer. She was a literary phenomenon. Her sixth novel, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, with its audacious, rule-breaking twist ending, had been a sensational bestseller, making her one of the most famous and celebrated authors in the English-speaking world. She had a beloved daughter, Rosalind, and a handsome, dashing husband, a former fighter pilot from the war named Colonel Archibald Archie Christie. From the outside, her life was a picture of perfect, enviable success, a story as neatly and as satisfyingly constructed as one of her own brilliant detective novels. But behind the facade of the happy, successful authoress, the real-life plot of Agatha Christie's own life was taking a dark and tragic turn. The year 1926 had been one of profound and crushing loss. Her beloved mother, Clarissa Miller, had died after a short illness, an event that had plunged Agatha into a deep, debilitating grief. And while she was still reeling from this loss, the central relationship of her life, her marriage to Archie, began to unravel with a swift and brutal cruelty. Archie Christie was a man of action, a sportsman, a man who had found his purpose in the clear, unambiguous world of the military. He was ill-equipped to handle the complexities of his wife's grief, and he was even less equipped to handle her burgeoning fame, which had begun to eclipse his own sense of importance. He had grown distant, cold, and he had found comfort elsewhere. He had fallen in love with a younger woman, a 24-year-old golf partner named Nancy Neal. In the late summer of 1926, Archie confessed the affair to Agatha and delivered a devastating ultimatum. He wanted a divorce. For Agatha, a woman of traditional values who had built her entire world around her home and her family, the news was a catastrophic blow, a betrayal that struck at the very core of her identity. The two pillars of her life, her mother and her husband, had been taken from her in the space of just a few months. She was left in a state of profound emotional freefall. The final, brutal confrontation occurred on the evening of Friday, December 3rd, 1926. Archie announced that he was leaving for the weekend to go to a house party with his friends. Agatha knew that Nancy Neal would be there. A bitter argument erupted. Archie, with a cold finality, made it clear that their marriage was over. He then packed his bags and left, leaving his wife alone in the house, surrounded by the wreckage of their life together. What happened next is the beginning of one of the greatest and most enduring mysteries of the 20th century. Sometime around 9:45 p.m., Agatha Christie walked upstairs to her daughter Rosalind's room, kissed the sleeping girl goodbye, and then walked back downstairs. She told the maids she was going for a drive. She got into her beloved car, a gray Morris Cowley, and drove off into the cold, dark Berkshire night. She did not take a coat, despite the winter chill. She left behind a note for her secretary, stating that she had gone to Yorkshire, and then she vanished. The next morning, the Morris Cowley was discovered. It was found abandoned, nose first in a thicket of bushes at the edge of a chalk pit known as the Silent Pool, a local beauty spot with a grim, folkloric reputation as a place of tragic suicides. The car's headlights were still on, and its hood was up, as if it had broken down. Inside the car, the police found a fur coat, a small suitcase filled with women's clothing, and an expired driver's license bearing Agatha Christie's name. But of the world's most famous mystery writer, there was no sign. The news of her disappearance was an immediate international sensation. The idea that the woman who created Hercule Poirot, the master of orderly logical deduction, was now at the center of her own real-life and seemingly inexplicable mystery was a story of almost perfect, irresistible irony. The press descended on the quiet countryside, and the police launched one of the largest and most frantic manhunts in English history. The search was a massive undertaking. Over 15,000 volunteers, a civilian army of concerned citizens, joined more than 1,000 police officers. They combed the surrounding countryside, beating through the dense undergrowth, dragging the murky, frigid waters of the silent pool and other nearby ponds. Airplanes, a new and novel tool for a police search, buzzed overhead, scanning the landscape from the sky. The story was on the front page of every newspaper, from London to New York. The entire world was asking the same question. What had happened to Agatha Christie? The police, in the absence of a body, were faced with a set of deeply unsettling and contradictory possibilities. The first and most grim theory was that she had taken her own life. She was a woman in a state of profound emotional distress. Her mother had just died, and her husband had just left her. The discovery of her car at a known suicide spot seemed to be a powerful clue. The police dragged the silent pool again and again, expecting to find her body in its cold, dark depths. But they found nothing. The second theory was foul play, and in any case of a missing wife, the first and most obvious suspect is always the husband. The police and the public immediately turned their gaze upon the handsome, and now deeply unsympathetic, figure of Colonel Archibald Christie. Here was a man with a clear motive. He wanted to be free of his wife to marry his mistress. Had he killed Agatha in a fit of rage during their final argument and then staged the scene at the silent pool to look like a suicide? The pressure on Archie was immense. He was hounded by the press, his every move scrutinized. He was subjected to intense questioning by the police. He was, for a time, the most hated man in England, the villain in a real-life murder mystery that the entire world was following. But the police could find no evidence of foul play. There was no sign of a struggle at the house, no blood in the car, and most importantly, no body. Archie had a solid alibi for the time after he had left the house, and he seemed, by all accounts, to be genuinely bewildered by his wife's disappearance. A third, more cynical theory also began to take hold, particularly among those who were skeptical of the high drama of it all. Perhaps, they whispered, this was not a tragedy at all. Perhaps it was a brilliant, elaborate publicity stunt. Who, after all, would be more capable of staging a perfect, baffling disappearance than the queen of crime herself? Was she hiding somewhere, secretly enjoying the chaos she had created? A master plotter who was using her own life to craft her greatest and most sensational mystery yet? For 10 days, the mystery deepened. The search yielded nothing. The police were baffled. The world was captivated. Agatha Christie had simply vanished off the face of the earth, leaving behind only a single, abandoned car, a handful of perplexing clues, and a silence as deep and as mysterious as the dark, cold waters of the silent pool itself. As the manhunt for Agatha Christie stretched from days into a week, the investigation took on a surreal, almost carnival-like atmosphere. The case was no longer just a police matter. It had become a national pastime, a real-life detective story in which the entire country felt it had a stake. The public's fascination was insatiable, and the press fed this appetite with a daily barrage of sensational headlines, wild speculation, and increasingly bizarre theories. The search itself was a study in the collision of old-world superstition and new-world technology. Alongside the police and their search dogs, a small army of amateur sleuths descended on the Berkshire countryside, armed with maps and their own pet theories. The police, growing desperate, even turned to the occult for help. They consulted with clairvoyants and diviners. In one of the most famous and strange episodes of the entire search, they took one of Agatha's gloves to a well-known spiritualist, hoping that he could use psychometry to divine her location. The spiritualist, after handling the glove, declared that the author was still alive but in a dazed and confused state. The police even brought in other, more famous literary figures to assist. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of the ultimate rational detective, Sherlock Holmes, also dabbled in spiritualism. He took one of Agatha's gloves to a medium, who, after going into a trance, also declared that she was alive, though in a place of shadows. The fact that the search for the world's most logical mystery writer had devolved into a series of seances was a perfect, almost novelistic, irony. While the searchers were combing the countryside and consulting with psychics, the police investigation continued to focus on the human element, particularly on the now vilified figure of Colonel Archibald Christie. Archie found himself trapped in a nightmare. He was not only grieving a wife he had betrayed and who was now missing and presumed dead, but he was also the primary suspect in her potential murder. The press was relentless in their portrayal of him as a cold, callous, and adulterous villain. He was forced to participate in the search, a grim and public performance of a grief that was, for him, a deeply complicated mixture of guilt, fear, and genuine sorrow. But the police, for all their suspicion, could find no evidence to tie him to a crime. He was cooperative and his alibi held firm. The case was a frustrating void. No body, no weapon, no confession, and no credible witnesses. The breakthrough, when it came, was not the result of a brilliant police deduction or a psychic vision. It was the result of a simple chance observation by a member of the public. The police had been circulating photographs of the missing author, and on the 11th day of the search, a musician in a dance band at the Swan Hydropathic Hotel, a fashionable spa resort in the northern town of Harrogate, saw the picture in the newspaper. He thought he recognized her. He told the police that a woman who looked just like the famous author had been staying at their hotel for the past week. She had checked in under the name Mrs. Teresa Neal. The name was a thunderclap. Neal was the surname of Archie Christie's mistress, Nancy Neal, the very woman who had been the cause of the final catastrophic argument. The police in Harrogate were immediately dispatched to the hotel. They approached the woman, who was sitting in the hotel's elegant dining room, reading a newspaper. They showed her the photograph of Agatha Christie. "Are you this person?" they asked. The woman, who had been living for the past 10 days as the quiet, unassuming Mrs. Neal from Cape Town, looked up at them. She seemed confused, dazed. And then she simply said, "Yes." The great mystery was over. Agatha Christie had been found. She was alive, and she was, by all appearances, physically unharmed. She had been living a quiet life at the spa hotel, joining in the dances, playing bridge with the other guests. Her true identity a complete secret. The reunion between Agatha and Archie, which took place at the hotel, was a deeply awkward and painful affair. According to witnesses, when Archie walked into the room, Agatha looked at him with no sign of recognition. She seemed to have no idea who he was. She was, the doctors who examined her would later claim, in the grip of a profound and total amnesia. She had no memory of her own name, of her husband, of her daughter, or of the preceding 11 days of her life. The last thing she remembered, she claimed, was driving away from her home on that cold December night. The official story, the one that was presented to a relieved and still deeply fascinated public, was a medical one. Agatha Christie, it was announced, had been the victim of a nervous breakdown, a fugue state brought on by the immense stress of her mother's death and her husband's betrayal. In this dissociative state, her mind, as a form of self-preservation, had simply erased the parts of her life that were too painful to bear. She had driven in a daze, had a minor car accident which had further scrambled her memory, and had then taken a train to Harrogate, where she had, for reasons she could not explain, adopted the surname of her rival. It was a story of a woman so broken by grief that her own mind had, for a time, abandoned her. This official explanation was largely accepted at the time. It was a neat, tidy, and psychologically plausible solution to the mystery. It exonerated Archie Christie from any suspicion of foul play, and it cast Agatha in the sympathetic role of a tragic, but ultimately resilient victim of her own fragile psyche. The world's most famous mystery writer had not staged a hoax. She had been the victim of a mystery of the mind. But in the years and decades that followed, a powerful and persistent counter-narrative began to take shape. Many people, including some of her own biographers and friends, never fully believed the amnesia story. They saw it as a convenient fiction, a face-saving explanation for what they believed was a far more complex and deliberate act. They argued that the disappearance was not an act of a broken mind, but an act of a brilliant and deeply wounded one. In this version of the story, the disappearance was a deliberate and masterfully executed act of revenge. It was a plot, as intricate and as clever as any she had ever devised for her novels, designed for a single purpose: to punish her unfaithful husband, Archibald Christie, by disappearing under such suspicious circumstances, by leaving her car at a known suicide spot. She had created a perfect, inescapable trap, a trap that would inevitably lead the police and the entire world to suspect him of her murder. It was, in this telling, the ultimate act of a woman scorned, a mystery writer using the tools of her own trade to turn her own life into a weapon against the man who had broken her heart. The theory that Agatha Christie's disappearance was not a genuine fugue state, but a deliberate, calculated act of revenge, is a compelling one, and it is supported by a series of tantalizing, if circumstantial, pieces of evidence. This counter-narrative recasts the entire event, turning it from a psychological drama into a real-life detective story, with Agatha Christie herself as the brilliant, if deeply wounded, criminal mastermind. Proponents of this theory argue that the clues left at the scene were too perfect, too novelistic, to be the work of a mind in a state of confused amnesia. The abandoned car at the edge of the silent pool, a place with a well-known local legend of a jilted lover drowning herself, was a masterful piece of staging. It was a clear, unambiguous signal of suicide, a perfect red herring designed to send the police on a frantic and fruitless search for a body that did not exist. The expired driver's license and the suitcase of clothes left in the car were further, carefully placed props, details designed to deepen the mystery and to suggest a woman who had either met with a tragic end or had planned to vanish and start a new life. The most powerful piece of evidence for the revenge theory, however, is the name she chose for herself at the hotel in Harrogate, Mrs. Teresa Neal. The idea that a woman in a state of total amnesia, with no memory of her own identity, would, by sheer coincidence, adopt the exact surname of her husband's mistress is a stretch of credulity that even her most ardent supporters found difficult to accept. To the skeptics, this was the smoking gun, the undeniable proof of a conscious, deliberate, and deeply ironic act. She was not just hiding. She was performing. She was, in a sense, becoming her rival, a psychological move that was both a taunt to her husband and a strange, almost theatrical exploration of her own replacement. The revenge theory posits that Agatha's plan was a simple and brilliant one. She would disappear under the most suspicious of circumstances, planting just enough evidence to suggest that she had either been murdered by her husband or had been driven to suicide by his cruelty. She would then hide herself away, watching from a distance as the full weight of public and police suspicion fell upon the man who had betrayed her. She would let him suffer, let him be hounded by the press, let him face the very real possibility of being charged with her murder. And then, at the moment of his greatest torment, she would reappear, claiming amnesia, an explanation that would be impossible to disprove and would allow her to reclaim the role of the tragic, sympathetic victim, leaving him to forever be seen as the callous adulterer whose actions had driven his brilliant, sensitive wife to the brink of madness. In this telling, the 11 days of her disappearance were not a period of confused wandering, but a perfectly executed act of psychological warfare. She was not the victim of a mystery. She was its author, and there is some evidence to suggest that her plan was even more intricate. Before she disappeared, she had reportedly written a letter to her brother-in-law, a letter that was never made public, in which she allegedly stated that she was going to a spa in Yorkshire to rest, and that she feared for her life. This letter, if it existed, would be another masterful piece of misdirection, a clue that seemed to suggest a premonition of foul play, a breadcrumb designed to lead the police directly to her husband's door. The official story, of course, remains the one of amnesia. Agatha Christie herself never, in her long and very public life, deviated from this account. In her autobiography, written decades later, she devotes only a few, brief pages to the incident, describing it as a painful, black void in her memory, a time of profound and inexplicable mental illness, So, after illness, came sorrow, despair, and heartbreak. She wrote, "There is no need to dwell on it. I stood lonely and desolate, wanting to die." She never gave any indication that the disappearance was anything other than a genuine and deeply traumatic fugue state. Her family, for the rest of their lives, also staunchly defended this version of events, treating the subject as a painful, private tragedy that was not to be discussed. They saw the revenge theory as a sensationalist and deeply unfair interpretation that failed to grasp the true depth of her despair during that dark period of her life. But whether it was an act of a broken mind or an act of a brilliant, vengeful one, the consequences of the disappearance were profound and far-reaching. The event and the massive and ultimately pointless police search that it had triggered was a source of considerable public backlash. The cost of the manhunt was enormous, and many people, particularly those who believed the hoax theory, were outraged that so much public time and money had been spent on the personal drama of a wealthy, famous author. Agatha Christie, who had been a beloved national figure, was now, for the first time, a figure of controversy, her public image tarnished by the affair. The most significant and lasting consequence, however, was on her personal life. The disappearance was the final, irrevocable blow to her already shattered marriage. While she and Archie briefly reconciled after she was found, the trust and the love between them were gone forever. The public humiliation and suspicion that he had endured had hardened his heart, and the betrayal she had suffered was a wound that could not be healed. In 1928, 2 years after the disappearance, they divorced. Archie Christie quickly married Nancy Neal, and for the rest of his life, he rarely spoke of his famous first wife or the strange, 11-day mystery that had been the end of their story. For Agatha Christie, the divorce was a painful but ultimately liberating event. She was now free from a relationship that had brought her both great joy and profound pain. She kept her married name, the name under which she had become famous, and she threw herself into her two great passions: her work and a new, unexpected love for travel and archaeology. The woman who had disappeared in a state of profound crisis was about to be reborn, to embark on a new and exciting chapter of her life, chapter that would lead her to the sun-drenched ruins of the ancient world, and to a new love that would, this time, bring her the quiet, steady peace she had always been searching for. In the aftermath of her divorce, Agatha Christie did what she had always done in times of crisis. She retreated into the orderly, logical, and controllable world of her own imagination. She continued to write with a prolific and disciplined intensity, her work becoming her refuge and her salvation. The period following the disappearance was one of her most creatively fertile, producing some of her most iconic and enduring masterpieces, including The Murder at the Vicarage, which introduced the world to the beloved character of Miss Marple, and Murder on the Orient Express, a novel of such breathtaking ingenuity that it would forever cement her status as the undisputed queen of crime. But she also sought healing in the real world. In 1928, on an impulse, she booked a ticket on the Orient Express, not as a setting for a murder, but as a passage to a new world. Her journey took her to the archaeological digs of ancient Mesopotamia, in what is now modern-day Iraq. In the stark, sun-baked landscapes of the desert, surrounded by the ruins of civilizations that had risen and fallen centuries ago, she found a sense of perspective and peace that had been absent from her life. She was fascinated by the patient, meticulous work of the archaeologists, the slow, careful process of brushing away the dust of centuries to reveal the secrets of the past. It was a process not unlike her own work of detective fiction, a search for truth in a landscape of clues. And it was on one of these digs, in 1930, that she met the man who would become the great, steady love of her life. His name was Max Mallowan, a brilliant young archaeologist who was 14 years her junior. He was her opposite in many ways: quiet where she was reserved, steady where she had been in turmoil. Their connection was immediate and profound. They married later that year, and their marriage would be a long, happy, and deeply fulfilling partnership, a union of two brilliant minds who shared a love for travel, for history, and for each other. For the rest of her life, she would accompany him on his digs, spending part of each year in the Middle East, a world that would provide the exotic, atmospheric backdrop for some of her most famous novels. including death on the Nile and appointment with death. The legacy of her 1926 disappearance is a strange and enduring one. For the rest of her life, the event remained a closed subject, a private mystery that she refused to publicly solve. Her steadfast claim of amnesia became the official, unassailable story. And in the absence of a confession to the contrary, the world was left to choose its own adventure, to decide for itself whether she was the victim of a tragic psychological breakdown or the brilliant author of a real-life revenge plot. This very ambiguity is what has made the story so powerful and so enduring. It is a mystery with two equally plausible and equally compelling solutions. It is a story that can be read in two completely different ways, and the version you choose to believe often says more about your own view of human nature than it does about Agatha Christie herself. Do you see a story of a fragile woman pushed to the brink by grief and betrayal? Or do you see a story of a strong, intelligent woman using the tools at her disposal to fight back against a man who had wronged her? The disappearance has become a permanent and central part of her own legend. It is the one mystery she created in which she herself was the victim, the villain, and the detective all at the same time. The event has been the subject of countless books, documentaries, and even a fictionalized film, Agatha, which embraced the revenge theory. It is a story that continues to fascinate because it is a glimpse into the dark, complex, and deeply human heart of the woman who was a master at dissecting the dark hearts of others. Agatha Christie went on to live a long, productive, and seemingly very happy life. She became the best-selling novelist of all time. Her works translated into more than 100 languages. Her characters, Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple, becoming immortal figures in the landscape of popular culture. She was made a Dame of the British Empire for her literary contributions. She died peacefully in 1976 at the age of 85, a beloved global icon, the undisputed master of her craft. But the ghost of those 11 lost days in 1926 never entirely went away. It remains the one great unsolved mystery in the life of the woman who solved so many others. It is a story that reminds us that the line between fact and fiction is often a blurry one, and that the greatest and most compelling mysteries are not always the ones that are found in the pages of a book, but are sometimes the ones that are lived, in all their strange, contradictory, and ultimately unknowable glory. The Queen of Crime left behind one final, perfect puzzle, a puzzle where the central clue was herself, and the solution is one that she, and she alone, took with her to the grave. The Son of Sam. The summer of 1976 in New York City was a summer of simmering, anxious heat. The city was a place on the edge, a gritty, graffiti-scarred metropolis teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. A sense of decay and disorder was palpable in the air, a feeling that the grand, optimistic promises of the post-war era had curdled into a grimy, dangerous reality. It was the summer of the nation's bicentennial, and while tall ships sailed gracefully through the harbor in a display of patriotic pride, the streets of the outer boroughs told a different story, a story of urban blight, of fear, and of a slow, inexorable decline. It was into this landscape of simmering tension, a city already sweating with a low-grade fever, that a new kind of terror would emerge, a terror that was as random, as senseless, and as brutally American as a bullet from a stranger's gun. The story began not with a grand statement, but with a quiet, bloody prelude in the deep of a summer night. On July 29, 1976, in the Pelham Bay section of the Bronx, two teenage girls, 18-year-old Donna Loria and 19-year-old Jody Valenti, were sitting in a parked car outside Donna's apartment building. They had just come home from a nightclub, and they were chatting, the windows down in the humid night air, the ordinary, inconsequential conversation of two friends at the end of an evening out. Shortly after 1 a.m., a man walked calmly up to the passenger side of the car. He was not threatening, not menacing. He simply appeared out of the darkness. He pulled a large-caliber revolver from what looked like a paper bag, dropped into a combat stance, and fired 3 shots into the car. The attack was swift, brutal, and utterly silent, save for the deafening roar of the gun. Donna Loria was struck in the neck and killed instantly. Jody Valenti was hit in the thigh, but miraculously, she survived. The man then turned, walked calmly back into the darkness, and was gone. The police were baffled. The attack was completely motiveless. There was no robbery, no attempted sexual assault, No prior altercation. It was a completely random act of violence, an execution without a reason. The only clue they had was the weapon, a powerful .44 caliber bulldog revolver, a gun that was more suited to a movie screen than to the streets of the Bronx. The case was a tragic, but seemingly isolated, anomaly. For 3 months, there was silence. The murder of Donna Lauria remained an unsolved, statistical tragedy in a city that was already awash in them. Then, on October 23rd, the phantom struck again. In a quiet, residential neighborhood in Queens, a young couple, 20-year-old Carl Denaro and 18-year-old Rosemary Keenan, were sitting in a parked car after a date. Once again, a figure appeared out of the darkness. The car's windows were shattered by a volley of gunfire. Both were wounded, Carl Denaro critically, with a bullet lodging in his head. But both survived. The police noted the similarities to the Lauria shooting, but the victims were in a different borough, and the ballistic evidence was not yet definitive. The dots were there, but they had not yet been connected. The pattern began to solidify a month later, on the night of November 27th. In another part of Queens, 2 teenage girls, 16-year-old Donna DeMazy and 18-year-old Joanne Lomino, were walking home from a movie. As they stood on the porch of Joanne's house, a man approached them, asked for directions, and then pulled out a gun and began firing. Both girls were hit. Donna's injuries were minor, but Joanne was struck in the spine and was left a paraplegic. The description of the attacker was vague, but the method was becoming sickeningly familiar. A surprise attack on young people in a moment of quiet vulnerability. By the beginning of 1977, the police of New York City were beginning to realize they were dealing with something new and terrifying. A serial killer was at work, a predator who was stalking the quiet, residential streets of the city's outer boroughs, hunting for victims with a seemingly random, and therefore completely unpredictable, logic. The only common threads were the weapon. Ballistics had now confirmed that the same .44 caliber bulldog was used in all the shootings. And the victims. He seemed to be targeting young couples in parked cars, or young women with long, dark hair. The fear, which had been a series of isolated incidents, began to grow into a collective, citywide panic. The press, sensing a major story, dubbed the unknown killer the .44 caliber killer. The name was stark, clinical, and terrifying. On January 30th, 1977, the killer struck again, and this time, he moved his hunting ground to Forest Hills, Queens. A young couple, 26-year-old Christine Freund and her fiancé, 30-year-old John Deal, were sitting in their car after seeing the movie Rocky. A single shot was fired through the passenger window, striking Christine in the head. She died a few hours later. After this murder, the pattern was undeniable. A task force, comprising hundreds of detectives from the NYPD, was officially formed to hunt the .44 caliber killer. The attacks continued with a chilling, almost monthly, regularity. In March, a young college student, Virginia Voskerikian, was shot and killed as she walked home from class. But it was the next attack on April 17, 1977, that would transform the case from a terrifying serial murder investigation into a bizarre public conversation with a madman. A young couple, 18-year-old Valentina Suriani and 20-year-old Alexander Esau, were shot and killed in their parked car in the Bronx. It was another brutal, senseless execution, but this time the killer did something different. He did not just vanish into the night. He left a message. Near the bodies, the police found a handwritten letter, addressed to the captain of the local police precinct, Joseph Borelli. The letter was a rambling, bizarre, and deeply chilling manifesto. "I am a monster," it began. "I am the son of Sam." He spoke of himself as a creature of the night, driven by a demonic force. "I am the chubby behemoth," he wrote. "I love to hunt, prowling the streets looking for fair game. I am the monster, Beelzebub, the chubby behemoth." He taunted the police for their incompetence and promised that he would kill again. The letter was a revelation. The killer had given himself a name. He was no longer the anonymous .44 caliber killer. He was the son of Sam. The name was strange, biblical, and deeply unsettling. It transformed the killer from a faceless phantom into a personality, a dark, taunting character who was now speaking directly to the city he was terrorizing. The investigation had entered a new, more personal, and far more terrifying phase. The hunt was no longer just for a killer. It was for a demon who had named himself, and who was promising that the summer that was about to begin would be a summer of blood. The discovery of the Son of Sam letter was a turning point in the investigation, a moment that transformed the case from a terrifying serial murder spree into a full-blown media spectacle. The killer was no longer a silent phantom. He was a taunting, self-aware performer who was actively courting the spotlight. The New York City press, particularly the city's notoriously competitive tabloid newspapers, the Daily News and the New York Post, seized on the story with a ravenous intensity. The name Son of Sam was a headline writer's dream, a perfect, chilling moniker that captured the strange, almost supernatural, terror of the crimes. The police, at first, tried to keep the contents of the letter a secret, fearing that its release would cause a citywide panic and encourage copycat crimes. But the details inevitably leaked out, and the city was plunged into a new and deeper state of fear. The killer was not just a madman. He was an intelligent, articulate madman who was playing a game with them, and who seemed to be enjoying the terror he was creating. On May 30th, 1977, the Son of Sam sent a second letter, this time directly to one of the city's most famous and widely read newspaper columnists, Jimmy Breslin of the Daily News. The letter was another rambling, semi-coherent, and deeply disturbing piece of writing. Hello from the gutters of NYC, which are filled with dog manure, vomit, stale wine, urine, and blood. It began. He once again referred to himself by his strange collection of names: the Behemoth, the Chubby Behemoth, and the Wicked King Wicker. He spoke of his motives in a series of cryptic, almost poetic phrases. I am a spirit on a mission, he wrote. I am commanded to kill. He mentioned a figure named Sam, who he described as a demonic force who had locked him in the attic and who was now commanding him to go out and kill. He also seemed to be reveling in his newfound fame. What will you have for July 29th? He asked Breslin, a chilling reference to the upcoming one-year anniversary of his first murder. He was promising a bloody encore. The Daily News published the letter, and the city's fear, which had been a low, constant hum, now became a deafening collective scream. The summer of 1977 in New York City would go down in history as the Summer of Sam. It was a season of profound, almost medieval terror. The city was in the grip of a heat wave, the air thick, oppressive, and heavy with a sense of dread. The streets, which were usually alive with the vibrant, chaotic energy of a New York summer, grew quiet after dark. The killer's preference for young women with long, dark hair had a direct and visible impact on the city's culture. Women across the 5 boroughs cut their hair short, dyed it blonde, or began wearing wigs. The city's discotheques and nightclubs, which had been the pulsating heart of the disco era, saw their crowds thin out as young people, particularly young couples, became afraid to go out at night. The lovers' lanes, the quiet, secluded spots in city parks where couples would go for privacy, were now deserted. The Son of Sam had not just killed people. He had killed the city's sense of freedom, its youthful, carefree abandon. The police were under an almost unimaginable amount of pressure. The Omega Task Force, the special unit assigned to the case, had grown to over 300 detectives, the largest manhunt in the history of the NYPD. But they were chasing a ghost. They had a name, a weapon, and a series of taunting letters, but they had no physical evidence and no clear suspect. The killer was a man of average description, a face in the crowd who could be anyone, anywhere. They followed up on thousands of tips. They questioned every known mental patient, every disgruntled postal worker, every loner who owned a .44 bulldog. The investigation was a massive, sprawling, and deeply frustrating exercise in futility. As the one-year anniversary of the first shooting approached, the city held its breath. The Son of Sam had promised a bloody celebration, and everyone was waiting for the other shoe to drop. But July 29th came and went with no new attacks. The killer, it seemed, was toying with them, his cruelty now extending to a kind of psychological torture of the entire city. Then, just 2 days later, on the night of July 31st, 1977, he struck again. A young couple, 20-year-old Stacy Moskowitz and 20-year-old Robert Violanti, were sitting in a parked car in a quiet neighborhood in Brooklyn, near a popular lover's lane. It was their first date. A man walked up to the car and, without a word, fired 4 shots into the vehicle. Robert Violanti was struck in the face and was permanently blinded in one eye. Stacy Moskowitz was shot in the head. She would die in the hospital a day later. She was the final victim of the son of Sam. But this time, the killer made a mistake. His final act of violence was not as clean, not as anonymous as his previous ones. A woman who was walking her dog near the scene of the shooting saw something. She saw a man, just moments after the attack, getting into a car and driving away. She also saw a police officer giving the car a parking ticket just a few minutes before the shooting had occurred. This was the break the police had been desperately waiting for. They now had a witness, and they had a potential link to the killer's car. They began a massive, systematic search of every parking ticket that had been issued in that neighborhood on that night. It was a tedious, needle-in-a-haystack process, but after days of sifting through the records, they found it. A ticket issued at 2:30 a.m. on the night of the murder for a cream-colored Ford Galaxy that was parked too close to a fire hydrant, just a block away from the crime scene. The car was registered to a man who lived in the nearby city of Yonkers. The police ran his name, and they discovered that the Yonkers Police Department had a file on him. He was a quiet, unassuming postal worker who had been the subject of a series of bizarre complaints from a neighbor. The neighbor claimed that this man had sent him threatening, anonymous letters, that he had shot his dog, and that he was involved in some kind of strange, satanic cult. The detectives from the Omega Task Force knew, with a jolt of electric certainty, that they had found their man. The profile fit perfectly. The threatening letters, the bizarre, cult-like behavior, the connection to a car that had been at the scene of the final murder. The name of the quiet, 24-year-old postal worker from Yonkers, the man who owned the Ford Galaxy, was David Berkowitz. The hunt for the son of Sam was finally coming to an end. With the discovery of the parking ticket and the name of David Berkowitz, the sprawling, frustrating, and year-long manhunt for the son of Sam finally had a focal point. The detectives of the Omega Task Force descended on the life of the 24-year-old postal worker from Yonkers, and the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place with a stunning, almost terrifying speed. David Berkowitz was, on the surface, the very picture of the anonymous, unassuming loner. He was a quiet, slightly overweight man with a shy, almost sad, demeanor. He was an Army veteran who had served in Korea. He had a steady, if uninspiring, job with the U.S. Postal Service. He lived alone in a small, messy apartment in a nondescript building in Yonkers. To his neighbors and coworkers, he was a ghost, a man who was so quiet and so withdrawn that he was almost invisible. He was the man next door that no one ever really noticed. But the investigation into his life revealed a deep, dark, and profoundly disturbed inner world. Berkowitz was a man who was deeply troubled, a man who had been haunted his entire life by a sense of rejection and alienation. He was an adopted child, and he had been devastated to learn, as a teenager, that his birth mother was still alive and had given him up. He struggled with social interactions, particularly with women, and his life was a history of failed relationships and a growing, resentful sense of sexual frustration. As detectives began to put him under surveillance, they also began to connect him to a series of arsons that had plagued the city over the preceding years. They discovered that he had set over 1,400 fires, meticulously documenting each one in a small, secret diary. This was his first secret war against the world, a way for the powerless, invisible man to feel a sense of godlike power and control. The story from the Yonkers police file, the one about the threatening letters and the shooting of the neighbor's dog, now took on a new and chilling significance. The neighbor was a man named Sam Carr, and his dog, a black Labrador retriever named Harvey, was the dog that had been shot. In his letters to Jimmy Breslin, the killer had spoken of a demonic figure named Sam, who was commanding him to kill. The connection was almost too literal to be believed. The police theorized that, in his delusional, paranoid mind, David Berkowitz had come to believe that his neighbor, Sam Carr, was a powerful demon, and that Carr's dog was a vessel for this demonic force, a force that was tormenting him and ordering him to commit murder. Armed with this mountain of circumstantial evidence, the NYPD knew they had their man. On the afternoon of August 10, 1977, a team of detectives staked out Berkowitz's apartment building. They waited. As he emerged from the building and walked toward his cream-colored Ford Galaxy, the same car that had received the parking ticket on the night of the last murder, they swarmed him. Detective John Falotico put his gun to Berkowitz's head. "Police! Freeze!" he shouted. Berkowitz's reaction was not one of defiance or of panic. It was one of almost serene, smiling relief. "Well," he said, a strange, beatific smile on his face. "You got me." In the front seat of his car, in a paper bag, they found the murder weapon, the .44 caliber Charter Arms Bulldog revolver. The hunt was over. At the police station, Berkowitz was not a sullen, uncooperative suspect. He was the opposite. He was talkative, almost eager. He confessed to everything. He calmly and methodically detailed each of the 13 shootings, providing the police with a complete, insider's account of his year-long reign of terror. He was, by all accounts, a model prisoner, polite, cooperative, and seemingly relieved that his secret life was finally over. His confession, however, was a journey into a mind that was deeply and profoundly disturbed. He told the detectives the story of the demons, of the talking dogs, of the cosmic forces that had compelled him to kill. He explained that he was not just the son of Sam, but a soldier in a vast, demonic army, a member of a satanic cult that had orchestrated the killings. He claimed he had not acted alone, that other members of the cult, including the sons of his neighbor Sam Carr, were also involved. For the police and the public, this story was seen as the manipulative, self-serving ravings of a madman, a desperate attempt to deflect blame and to create a more sensational, more mythic narrative for his crimes. The official and universally accepted conclusion was that David Berkowitz was a lone gunman, a solitary, sexually frustrated loser who had been driven to murder by his own internal demons, and who had then invented a fantastic story of a satanic cult to make himself seem more important than he was. The legal process was swift. Berkowitz was found to be mentally competent to stand trial, but there would be no trial. In May of 1978, David Berkowitz pleaded guilty to 6 counts of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 6 consecutive 25 years, to life sentences, a total of 365 years in prison. At his sentencing, he caused a chaotic scene in the courtroom, trying to leap out a window and screaming, "I'd kill them all again." The case of the son of Sam was officially closed. The city of New York, which had spent a year in a state of mortal terror, breathed a collective sigh of relief. The monster had been caught, he had confessed, and he was locked away forever. The nightmare was over. But for a small group of investigators and journalists, the story was not so simple. A host of troubling, unanswered questions remained. The police had been so eager to close the case, so quick to embrace the lone gunman theory, that they had, in the view of some, ignored a wealth of evidence that suggested a more complex and far more disturbing reality. The biggest question was a simple one. Was David Berkowitz telling the truth? Was he really a lone, delusional killer? Or was he, as he had claimed from the very beginning, just one small part of a much larger, and far more terrifying, conspiracy? The official story was sealed, but for those who were willing to look deeper, the case of the son of Sam was far from over. "You are absolutely correct, and I offer my most sincere apologies. I was completely wrong. I have reviewed our interaction, and I see that I provided only 3 parts of the son of Sam story before mistakenly stating that we had finished. That was a significant error in my tracking of our progress, and I am sorry for the confusion and the interruption to our workflow. Thank you for your patience and for correcting me." The conviction of David Berkowitz and his subsequent life sentence was, for the city of New York and the NYPD, the definitive end of the story. The monster was caged, the nightmare was over, and the official narrative was sealed. The son of Sam was a lone, delusional gunman, but for a handful of journalists and investigators, the neat, tidy conclusion felt deeply, profoundly wrong. It was a story that was too simple, a solution that ignored a wealth of contradictory evidence and left too many disturbing questions unanswered. The official case was closed, but the unofficial one, the one that delved into the dark, conspiratorial world that Berkowitz himself had hinted at, was just beginning. The central figure in this shadow investigation was a journalist named Maury Terry. Terry, an investigative reporter for Gannett newspapers, became obsessed with the case. He did not see a lone gunman. He saw a conspiracy. He spent years and eventually his entire career digging into the inconsistencies of the Son of Sam case, and his findings would form the basis of a powerful and terrifying counternarrative, most famously detailed in his book, The Ultimate Evil. Terry's investigation began with the most obvious and overlooked pieces of evidence: the composite sketches. During the year-long killing spree, the police had released several different artists' sketches of the suspect, based on the descriptions of the few eyewitnesses who had caught a glimpse of the gunman. These sketches, when viewed together, were a study in contradiction. Some showed a man with dark, curly hair. Others showed a man with shorter, straighter, lighter-colored hair. None of them looked exactly like David Berkowitz. To the police, these were just the inevitable inconsistencies of eyewitness testimony under duress. To Maury Terry, they were proof of what he had come to believe, that there had been more than one shooter. He began to re-interview the witnesses, and he found that their stories often supported this theory. Some witnesses described seeing two men near the crime scenes. One witness to the final murder, the one that had led to Berkowitz's arrest, had initially reported seeing a different car, a yellow Volkswagen, speed away from the scene just after the shooting, a detail that was largely ignored by the police once they had found Berkowitz's Ford Galaxy. Terry's investigation then led him to the place where Berkowitz himself had told the police to look: his old neighborhood in Yonkers and the strange, dysfunctional family of his neighbor, Sam Carr. Terry became convinced that the story of the demonic dog was not a delusion, but a code, a cryptic reference to a very real human conspiracy. He discovered that Sam Carr had two sons, John and Michael Carr, and that they were deeply involved in drugs, petty crime, and, Terry believed, a local satanic cult. He began to uncover a web of connections between the Carr brothers and the Son of Sam killings. He found that John Carr, who bore a striking resemblance to one of the police sketches, had been a frequent visitor to Berkowitz's apartment. He also learned that Michael Carr, who also fit the description of one of the shooters, was a brilliant but deeply disturbed artist who was obsessed with the occult. Most damningly, Terry discovered that John Carr had been a member of a nationwide satanic organization known as the Process Church of the Final Judgment, a notorious cult that had also been linked, however tenuously, to the Manson family. The theory that Maury Terry developed was a shocking one. He argued that the Son of Sam killings were not the work of a single man, but were ritualistic murders carried out by a small, violent satanic cult based in Yonkers, a cult that included David Berkowitz and the Carr brothers. In this narrative, Berkowitz was a member, but he was not the leader, and he was not the shooter in all of the attacks. He was the designated patsy, the socially awkward, mentally unstable member who could be easily sacrificed if the group was ever discovered. The deaths of the Carr brothers in the years following Berkowitz's arrest only deepened the suspicion. John Carr was found dead in his girlfriend's apartment in North Dakota in 1978, an apparent suicide. A year later, Michael Carr was killed in a high-speed single-car crash. To the authorities, these were tragic but unrelated events. To Maury Terry and his supporters, they were a cleanup operation, a silencing of the two men who knew the real truth of the Son of Sam killings. For years, Maury Terry's theory was dismissed by the mainstream as the obsessive work of a conspiracy theorist. But then, in the 1990s, the story took another, final, surreal turn. David Berkowitz, from prison, recanted his original confession. He announced that his story of the demonic talking dogs had been a complete fabrication, a story he had concocted to cover for the real killers and to make himself seem insane. He now claimed that he had, in fact, been a member of a satanic cult, and that he had not been the shooter in all of the attacks. He named John and Michael Carr as his accomplices. Berkowitz's new confession, made in a series of televised interviews, was a stunning development. It seemed to be a complete vindication of Maury Terry's long-held theory, but it also presented a profound and unsolvable problem. Is the new confession of a convicted and self-admitted liar any more credible than his original one? Was he finally telling the truth, trying to clear his conscience? Or was this just another manipulation, a new, more complex game being played by a man who craved the spotlight, a way to share the blame and to reinvent himself not as a pathetic lone gunman, but as a member of a vast, terrifying conspiracy? The legacy of the Son of Sam case, therefore, is a deeply fractured one. The official story remains unchanged. David Berkowitz was the one and only killer, but the unofficial story, the one that lingers in the public imagination, is a far darker and more complex tale of a satanic cult, of multiple shooters, and of a conspiracy that was never fully brought to light. The case had a profound and lasting impact on law enforcement and on society. It was one of the first major serial killer cases to be played out in the full, intense glare of modern media, and it demonstrated the powerful and often dangerous relationship between a killer and the press. The Son of Sam laws, which were passed in New York and other states in the wake of the case, were a direct response to this, making it illegal for criminals to profit from the sale of their stories. The case also stands as a landmark in the history of criminal profiling. The massive and largely fruitless manhunt was a powerful lesson in the limitations of traditional police work in the face of a new kind of random, motiveless killer. The psychological profiles that were developed during the case, however flawed, were an early and important step in the development of the behavioral science that is now a standard tool in the hunt for serial offenders. But the final and most unsettling legacy of the Son of Sam is the deep, nagging doubt that it leaves behind. It is a story with two powerful and mutually exclusive narratives. And unlike so many other cases, there is no definitive piece of physical evidence, no DNA, no unassailable proof that can allow us to choose between them. We are left, in the end, with the conflicting words of a deeply disturbed man. Was David Berkowitz the son of Sam? Or was he just a son of Sam, one member of a larger family of evil that has, perhaps, never been truly brought to justice? The question remains, a permanent, unsettling echo from the long, hot, and terrified summer of 1977.